It is now almost 20 years since an Australian Treasurer unveiled the last big package of media regulation with his famous pledge to segregate the princes of print and the queens of screen. Paul Keating might still be convinced that double-breasted suits are the height of style, but the world has moved on. Now the princes of print are looking more and more like paupers. The queens of free-to-air screen are under mounting challenge from subscription invaders, and everywhere the internet is king. The phone was once a Bakelite brick safely attached to the wall of the family home or to the desk in the boss's office. Now it is an addictive tablet that stalks us everywhere, and talk has become an optional extra. Once the rivers of gold flowed into the pockets of local companies that generated original content with expanding teams of local journalists. Now, more often, those rivers enrich foreign empires that do no more than control the new information channels and mostly pay little tax and only lip service to the old standards of editorial integrity and social responsibility. The David tasked with wrangling this new Goliath, with the major media reforms now before federal parliament, is our special guest today, Communications Minister, the Honourable Mitch Fifield. Mitch Fifield was a senior political advisor to former Treasurer Peter Costello and worked in senior advisory roles with the Kennett and Greiner governments before being first elected to the Senate for Victoria in 2004. Formerly Assistant Minister for Social Services, he became Minister for Communications, Minister for the Arts and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Digital Government with the advent of the Turnbull government in September last year. We are delighted that he is with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mitch Fifield.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. And you shouldn't feel too upset that I'm lamenting the absence of Michael Rowland. I was speaking at an ABC showcase in Parliament House, Canberra, a month or two back. And I said that there were two people who kept me coming back to the ABC time and time again, and they were Geraldine Doog and Michael Rowland. And the reason I gave was because of their voices. Michael has a voice that is like molasses over velvet, but I do like you, Mark, as well. Rest assured. Mark, you were very kind to me. You didn't mention that I am also the manager of government business in the Senate. It's something that I try on a good day to forget. In that role as Christopher Pyne's Senate counterpart, I've come to accept that in the Senate we really are off Broadway. But the Prime Minister has addressed that by recalling the Senate for the 18th of April, where the Senate will indeed be a main stage production for a change. But it's great to be here at home in Melbourne, and can I say there's never been a more exciting time to be a Hawthorn supporter, other than perhaps 2015, 2014 and 2013, and I could go on. But it's great to be here. Melbourne is somewhere where I learnt a couple of important early lessons about the media and television in particular. I remember the first time I set foot inside Channel 9's former studios in Bendigo Street in 1996, trailing around behind a guy who has now become the chairman of Nine Entertainment. And those of you who remember Bendigo Street will recall that it had a reasonably slick foyer, but as soon as you went inside, everything was rather more functional. The lifts threatened to trap you inside, the carpet was worn, the paint was on the edge of peeling, and the only shiny thing really in the place beyond the foyer were those laminated posters of the stars. And why was that the case? Well, obviously, it's because they were things that the audience would never see. $1 spent behind the scenes on something the audience wouldn't see was $1 wasted. The other thing I remember about the old Bendigo Street studios was the horrible phone box studio that Sky used to have there, which was an ugly studio. And by that I don't mean it looked ugly, it did look ugly, but it was one of those unique and special studios that makes everyone who sits in it look ugly. Which I guess, given politics is show business for ugly people, Sky didn't see an issue with. But I think the other great lesson that I had about TV came one morning when I popped into Sky Studios after they moved to Southbank, and I noticed this fantastic new set, and I said to the Sky Bureau Chief, Aaron Young, this is fabulous, this must have set you back a bit. And he said, well actually no, Angelo gave me $2,000 and I went down to Bunnings and IKEA with my granddad and we knocked up at the studio. So my Bendigo Street experiences and my Sky experiences taught me that commercial media is relentlessly focused on the audience, and if you've got a spare dollar, you put it where it matters. And so a small subscription paid TV outfit pulled off a do-it-yourself job rather than let the audiences down. And I know there are similar stories when it comes to commercial radio and also newspapers across the country. Now, you'll notice that I'm not making any contrast here with a large public broadcaster as we lead into triennial funding decisions. I'm resisting temptation, but rest assured the ABC will be appropriately resourced to do its job and there won't be the need for Tony Jones to knock up the Q&A set anytime soon. But being relevant to your audience is something that has always been an imperative for commercial media, and that's more important than ever before because commercial media in Australia is facing great competition. What I want to do, what the Turnbull government wants to do, is to free the media of the cast iron shackles that constitute part of our media law today. And Mark mentioned the age of our media laws. They date back largely to 1987, and I think a lot of you, or some of you perhaps, can remember 1987. It was a time when you could buy the Sun News Pictorial in the morning and you could buy the Herald in the afternoon. The Fitzroy Lions were still kicking around in Melbourne in what was still the VFL. You could still lodge a deposit with the State Savings Bank of Victoria. The iPhone was still a couple of decades away. Obviously there was no Wi-Fi, no DVD. You could still purchase a tram ticket from a conductor and Melbourne Central Shopping Centre was still under construction. To some of us that doesn't seem long ago, but it is in fact an eon ago. The media landscape has changed since that time. The entire world has changed immeasurably. Yet the media laws that govern commercial radio, commercial TV and newspapers stem from that year, 1987. They've been tinkered with a little bit, but they're still fundamentally intact. They have many flaws, but there's one in particular that stands out, and that is that our media and control rules don't contemplate the existence of the internet. In fact, I can still remember the first time that I heard of the internet. I was at someone's house having dinner in about 1993, and the host was talking about this thing called the web. They were saying that the web is chaos, the web is the future, and I thought to myself, this web thing is never going to take off. But it has been one of the most incredibly positive forces in humanity and commercially since that time. In fact, it's impossible now to imagine what the world would be like without the internet. Yet, that's exactly what our media laws do. They maintain that the internet never happened, that it doesn't exist. Not only does it exist, it is fundamentally reshaping our economy. And if someone doesn't believe that, you only need to ask a taxi driver or someone who works or manages a store that sells DVDs, or a bookstore owner or a travel agent. This is something of which journalists don't need to be convinced. And I thought Greg Hywood had an interesting opinion piece last week where he was reflecting on his first day as a working journalist, and he stated that he was shown a desk with a fixed line telephone, a broken chair, an ancient and unloved typewriter and an empty ashtray. Perhaps the ashtray is the only thing that is a constant. But these days, gathering news, producing news is so different. If it's not tweeted straight away, it never happened. If your story isn't filed online within an hour, it's old news. Digital technology is reshaping our economy and the media in all sorts of ways. And it's had a material impact in my own portfolio as the Minister responsible for Australia Post. For the first 50 or 70 years of Australia Post's existence, it was so fundamental to communications, indeed it was the NBN of its time, that my role, Minister for Communications, was up until 1977 called the Postmaster General. I like the title. I'm thinking of maybe bringing it back. But Australia Post's world has changed. People are using the internet. Letter volumes are falling through the floor. Australians are now sending $1.4 billion fewer letters per year than they were in 2008. That's a 30% drop. Letter volumes are now about where they were in 1995, and as a result, Australia Post recently posted its first loss of about $200 odd million. Now this transition, it's hard, but it does create opportunities, and for an organisation like Post, that's in e-commerce and online shopping. Australians spend around $17 billion shopping online each year, and globally that is trending towards over $2 trillion per year. So there are certainly opportunities, and we can embrace those opportunities or we can be smashed by those opportunities. Like cassettes, like VHS, like TVs that had tubes in them, which were long since put out on the verge on hard rubbish days, our media laws similarly need to be junked. Now, many of you would know that the media laws that we have are based on 5 numerical tests, which are really designed to be a proxy for media diversity. And their basis is the historical dominance of newspapers and commercial radio and commercial TV. And so these rules only apply to those platforms. I can't say it enough, I know everyone in this room knows it, but they only apply to those platforms. And they are as archaic as they sound. The 75% audience reach rule, the 2 out of 3 rule, the 5-4 rule, the 2 to a market rule, the 1 to a market rule. Try explaining to someone under the age of 30 what these rules are meant to do and why we need them. My advice would be don't even try. Now, I think for many decades these rules were a reasonable way of ensuring we had diversity in the media marketplace. And I think to understand just how redundant these are, you only need to put yourselves in the shoes of a media consumer. Once upon a time, choice of media was limited by physical location. Now, all you need is a smartphone, a 4G or Wi-Fi connection, and your swiping finger and you're away. And consumers, as a result, can access almost any radio station, almost any TV station, any website, anywhere in the world, pretty much. Websites and social media now means that close to 50% of Australians are primarily accessing their news in that way. So the rules that supposedly protect our diversity, our media diversity, completely ignore the means by which half the population access their news. Now, you would be aware that I've put into the Parliament legislation to abolish the 75% audience reach rule and the 2 out of 3 rule. You would know that these rules currently prevent, for example, a metropolitan commercial television network merging with regional commercial networks. And they also prevent cross-media consolidation in licence areas where you've got the 3 regulated platforms. Now, these rules, I think, are now impeding the capacity of media organisations to configure themselves in the way that they think best suits them. Many of the journalists in this room already operate across the 3 regulated platforms. You write articles for newspapers and then you talk about them and the issues of the day on TV and on radio. Good news is there's no 2 out of 3 rule that applies to Patricia Cavellis or James Campbell yet. That sort of rule applies to their employers. Now, you'd be aware that one of the areas which has caused a little bit of concern is content, particularly TV content, in regional areas. When you talk about media reform, understandably people in regional areas get a little nervous. Here in Victoria, most of the state's regional areas are covered by what's known as the Regional Victoria Aggregated Market, and broadcasters in this market at the moment need to broadcast at least 720 points of local content every 6 weeks. Now, the government's reform package will activate additional local content protections when regional broadcasters, as a result of a trigger event, which would be a collection of licences having more than 75% audience coverage, would see new higher baseline standards for local content come into being, which we're proposing would be 900 points of local content every 6 weeks. In effect, a 25% increase on the current mandated conditions in licences. And in larger regional population centres, where there are currently no minimum requirements for local content in what are the non-aggregated markets, we'll be introducing for major population centres for the first time a new baseline. So you'd be aware, for instance, that last year WIN closed its Mildura news service. Following that decision, WIN relocated production from one part of Australia to another. Did it for commercial reasons. Under our proposed reforms, if there was a change in control leading to a trigger event, then residents of Mildura would have a mandated minimum local content requirement of 360 points over a 6-week period. So that is a new baseline for major population centres in non-aggregated markets. Now, we're not proposing as a government that we mandate where newsrooms are or we mandate where bodies are, but we can provide encouragement and reward for locally produced news. And that's what we'll be seeking to do by changing the point system that we currently have for regional content, where you get 1 point for locally relevant news, locally relevant content, you get 2 points for local news. But if that local news is filmed in that area, then you'll get 3 points. So it's to provide an encouragement for local content. Now, one of the issues that is raised when we're talking about media reform is the issue of diversity. And that's important, but I don't think there's a need to have concerns about that. We do have currently from the federal opposition their support for the 75% audience reach rule being removed. The federal opposition say that they have an open mind in relation to the 2 out of 3 rule, and it's issues of diversity that are cited for the retention of the 2 out of 3 rule, but that is an argument that I have some difficulty understanding. Let me restate again that this is a rule that pretends there are only 3 media platforms and that the internet doesn't exist. It does. and our laws need to reflect that. And why should we shackle Australian companies with rules that don't apply to their international competition? Australian media companies are challenged at the moment, even in the absence of these rules. Our media companies are increasingly competing in a global arena, increasingly competing for a fragmented audience, and we need to do what we can to assist our Australian domestic media companies. Diversity of media is most often, and the concern about it, something that's cited in regional areas that have smaller populations and therefore tend to have fewer media outlets. But the 2 out of 3 rule has little relevance to most regional areas. In 62 of the 99 regional and remote radio licence areas in Australia, there are only 2 of the 3 regulated media platforms currently operating. So the removal of the 2 out of 3 rule would have no impact in those areas. In around a third of the remaining 37 regional and remote radio licence areas, further consolidation can't occur because they are all at or below the diversity floor of a minimum of 4 voices under the 5-4 rule. So removal of the 2 out of 3 rule would only permit acquisition or merger activity in around a quarter of Australia's regional and remote media markets. And it's worth noting that we're proposing to remove 2 of the media rules. The remaining 3 will remain in place. Now, it's fair to say that there are varying degrees of enthusiasm amongst media organisations about the package that I'm putting forward, ranging from those who think what we're proposing is a good start through to those who wanted to go much further. But there is near unanimity amongst media organisations in one respect, and that is that if the package is to go forward through the Parliament, that both the 2 out of 3 rule and the reach rule must be removed together. It's my view that this legislation should go forward as a package. It shouldn't be split, and it should pass in its entirety. Obviously, the package that we've put forward is not the sum total of what is needed in the area of media reform. Whilst there are some things that divide free-to-air broadcasters, there's one issue that strongly unites them all, and that's the issue of licence fees. Currently, free-to-air TV broadcasters pay licence fees to the Commonwealth of about $173 million per year, and these companies obviously would prefer to pay less or none at all, and that's hardly surprising because companies want lower tax and that is not likely to make the headlines. But that said, I do have sympathy for the arguments of the free-to-airs. It's clear that the licence fees paid by Australian commercial broadcasters are high by international standards. These fees were established in an era where radio and TV essentially had a monopoly on electronic audiences, which clearly is not now the case. Some argue that licence fee relief will enable broadcasters to invest more in local content and production. Others argue that a reduction in licence fees would help viability, and I think both of those things are true. But whatever the case, the point is taxes should only ever be as high as they need to be. The other angle to this discussion is that broadcasters depend on the use of spectrum, which is a scarce and valuable public resource. So it's argued that because they get to use this valuable public resource to make a profit, broadcasters should pay to use it. And I agree. And in fact, that is what happens. But at the moment, the balance is wrong. Broadcasters pay only token amounts for the use of the spectrum, yet they're paying very large amounts as licence fees. So spectrum pricing is an important policy discussion to be had. It impacts not just on broadcasters, but a whole range of users, from telcos to the military to emergency services. And the price of spectrum should better reflect its value. The public owns the resource and it's appropriate that they receive fair value. Now, of course, the value of spectrum depends on what can be done with it, and the government has recently released a consultation paper that raises some of these issues. Then there's the question of the future of terrestrial digital TV. Advances in broadcast and compression technology are enabling broadcasters to create more channels in higher quality, but there's another horizon. Already, streaming video on demand services like Netflix are offering content in 4K, which is a resolution that offers picture quality 4 times that of high definition picture currently on Australian TV. And it won't be long before consumer expectation rises. And in the radio space, we've got to consider the future of digital radio. The technology has been rolled out in the mainland capital cities. It's currently being successfully trialled in Darwin and Canberra, but it's not available elsewhere in the country. So how a broader rollout could occur is a question that warrants further consideration. So there's a lot to do in this area. We've got policy challenges in the broadcasting space, licence fees, spectrum, technological change. We've got tremendous opportunity, and some of these issues will be material for the sustainability of broadcasters. And it's important as a government that we seek to get those transitions right. The media sector does face a lot of challenges. It is part of the transitioning economy that you will often hear government ministers talk about. How we respond to these transitions is important, and in my portfolio area, this package of media reform is but the first instalment of what it is that we need to do to make sure that this sector can transition. I do acknowledge the work that Malcolm Turnbull did as Communications Minister, who really first prosecuted the reforms that I'm putting forward, and it's the Prime Minister who has had the will to see this package brought forward. This sector does have a bright future. There's a lot of change, but together I'm confident that we can manage it. We can make the right policy decisions to make sure that Australian media goes from strength to strength. Thanks very much.